Hello everybody, welcome to our video. Welcome to our video presentation. Learning Outcome 4.2, the obligation of the debtor or obligor. So before we start, I would like to introduce myself. I am Ian Jasper Borja, together with my companions, Juan Charisma Dimpol, Janelle Sidney Loterte, Rosel May Guillermo, Bernadette Cariaga, and Laius Kate. So, in this topic, we are going to tackling all about the duties of debtor or obligor. So, before we dive into the deep meaning of their obligations, let's have first the four ways to determine the debtors or obligors obligation. So, first, we have the obligation to give a specific or determinate thing. The second one is obligation to give a generic or indeterminate thing. The third one is obligation to do, and the fourth one is obligation not to do. So before we define all of them, so let's take a look what is the meaning of obligor or debtor. So we all know that obligor or debtor is a person who owes a legal obligations to another person. So in financing or arrangements, an obligor is usually a debtor. So, for example, a borrower. Sila yung mga humihingi or sila yung mga humihiram. So, or or someone who has given security or a guarantee for the payment of a debtor or the performance of the obligation. So, ito rin ay, or sila rin yung mga tao to entity who is legally or contractually obliged to profile a benefit of payment to or benefit or payment to another. Okay, so let's now proceed to the four ways, starting with the number one, obligation to give a specific or determinate thing. So when we say specific or determinate thing, these are the obligation to deliver a determinate thing as a general rule is extinguished if the thing is lost due to fortuitous events. So, when it said determinate, a thing when it is particularly designated or physically segregated from all others of the same class. So, anong mangyayari if the obligation to deliver a determinate thing when it was lost due to a fortuitous events? So, ano yung mga mangyayari ba? Kung sakasakali. So, fortuitous events does not necessarily extinguish the obligation to deliver a determinate thing. It shall be extinguished when the determinate thing shall be lost or destroyed without fault of the obligor or the debtor and before he or she is in default. So, nawawala ang bisa ng isang obligasyon kapag ang isang tao or yung mismong gumagawa ng obligation ay hindi siya yung rason para sirain yung obligation or kung ano man yung kontratang kanilang napagkasunduan. So, ayon. So, the second one is the obligation to give a generic or indeterminate thing. So, kapag sinabi rin nating indeterminate thing or generic thing, ito is yung mga something which is not particularized or specified but has reference only to a class or genus. For example, car, money, the things that we have. So, sinasabi na if the person wants to give you a car, then you also should give the same as what she or he gave to you. So, kapag sinabi ko na bibigyan kita ng car, so bigyan mo rin dapat ako ng car. Dapat pantay tayo. Ganon. So, it could also be something vague or not established. So, for example, when no one is sure what caused a fire to start. So, yung mga tao, di ba, kadalasan may nangyayaring krimen and or hindi krimen or yung mga natural, kumbaga nag-tsunami sa isang lugar and then yung lugar na yon ay hindi naman natin alam kung ba't nag-tsunami, hindi naman lumindol like that. So, that's the indeterminate or ayan yung obligation to give a generic or indeterminate thing. So, hindi mo alam yung mga mangyayari or you are not sure what caused sa mga bagay or sa mga things na nangyari. So, hindi mo alam kung saan nagsimula, parang ganon. So, the third one is the obligation to do. So, obligation to do is a duty wherein you created voluntarily. Something by which a person is bound or obliged to do certain things and which arises out of a sense of duty or results from customs or law or etc. So, something that is done or is to be done for such reasons to fulfill one's obligation. So, ito yung mga sinasabi natin na sa mga law, the obligation refers to the requirement to participate in a certain actions because of their agreement to another party or under the law. So, ito yung mga sinasabi natin na obligation that we need to fulfill for us to para hindi tayo lumabag sa batas. So, kung meron man tayong napagkasundoan sa law or parang kontrata, ganon, we have or we must have to fulfill the obligation that we promise to each other. So, for example, ang best example nito is that if both parents o kumbaga yung parents ng isang bata ay separated and then yung bata ay kailangan ng daily needs, syempre mag-aaral, ganon, yung mother and yung father is that mag-aapela sa korte para paghatian nila yung mga kinakailangan or kakailanganin ng bata. So, that would be the obligation na kanilang gagawin. So, yung obligation ng mother and father would be giving the sustaining the daily needs of the child. So, ayun yung best example nito, the obligation to do. So, lastly, we have the obligation not to do. So, what is obligation not to do naman? So, obligation not to do is when the obligation consists in not doing and the obligor does what has been forbidden him. So, it shall be undone at his expenses. So, sinasabi dito na kapag yung isang tao ay may ginawa na paglabag is magmumulta siya. So, ang best example nito is that yung kumbaga si person A at si person B had been argued since the day that person B was build extension to his house. So, unfortunately, yung person A is sa kanya yung lupa and then yung person B naman is binaliwala niya. So, ano yung magiging consequence nun? Of course, si person B must be punished kasi nga hindi niya sinunod yung batas na meron sa person A. So, yun yung mga obligation not to do na dapat na sinusunod natin. So, sinusunod natin na hindi sundin yung mga ganong bagay. So, nagigets nyo ba? So, tayo, di ba, bilang mga tao, kung iniisip nyo, ano ba yung mga obligation natin na hindi dapat natin gawin? So, yung mga obligation natin na hindi dapat natin gawin ay pumatay, di ba, manira ng tao, or magnakaw, of course, kasi yan ay against the law. So, kapag ginawa mo lahat ng yon, lalabag ka sa batas at ikaw ay mapaparusahan under the law. Ayan lamang po ang aking explanation sa 4 na ways to determine the debtor's or obligor's obligation. At para mas maintindihan pa natin ng mas malalim na meaning ng mga ito ay let's have Kate and Luterte.
A specific determinating, number 1. To deliver the thing. In an obligation to deliver a determinating, the very thing itself must be delivered. Number 1, example, the appliances shop will now give the customer the oven he especially buy. And in this choice, the serial number or the model name and brand name is included in the receipt. And it must match to the description of the oven they bought. Number 2, to take care of the thing before delivery, Article 1163. In every person obligated to give something is also obligated to take care of it with the proper diligence of a good father of a family unless the law stipulation of the parties requires another standard. These articles speak of an obligation to take care of the terminating. Example, appliances store is storing their stocks as the physical appearance and packaging and operational quality must not be degraded or affected due to improper handling or storing. General indeterminacy. Number 1, to deliver the thing. If the thing is indeterminate or genetic, he may ask the obligation to be complied with at the expenses of debtor. If the obligor delays or has a promise to deliver the same something or same thing to two or more persons who do not have the same interest, he or she shall be responsible for any fortuitous even until he has effected the delivery. To deliver a thing which is of the quality intended by the parties, taking into consideration the purpose of the obligation and other circumstances. Number 2, to bear the expenses of having someone else comply with the obligation, Article 1165. To be liable for damages in case of fraud, negligence, or delay in the performance of his obligation or contravention of the tenor or thereof.
Number 3, to deliver the fruits of the thing under Article 1164. Ano nga ba yung nandito sa Article 1164? So, states that Article 1164, the creditor has a right to the fruits of the thing from the time the obligation to deliver arises. However, he shall acquire no real right over it until the same has been delivered to him. So, ano nga ba yung sinasabi ditong fruits? Ano yung sinasabing creditor has a right to the fruits? Ano yung fruits na sinasabi dito? So, may kinds of fruits tayo. Ito yung natural fruits, industrial fruits, and civil fruits. First, let's take a look at natural fruits. So, natural fruits. Natural fruits, the spontaneous products of the soil and the young and other products of animals. So, for better understanding, ang natural fruits na tinutukoy is yung mga tumutubo, like sa inyong property. Pag sinabi nating natural fruits, ito yung mga kusang nagkaroon without the intervention of human. Walang intervention of human, wala silang ginawa. So, meaning kusa yung tumubo, kusa siyang nagkaroon dun, without the intervention of human. So, may example tayo dito, para mas maintindihan pa. So, ako, binenta ko ng 35k kay Ian yung baka ko. Which is, walang petsa kung kailan ide-deliver sa kanya kay Ian yung baka. Which in the end, nanganak yung baka. And then, so, ang question doon, kanino, who has the right para kunin yung baka, yung nanganak na baka? Siyempre, kay Ian na, kasi nabayaran na, nabenta na. Ang right ko na lang is ibibigay, ide-deliver sa kanya yung baka, yung nanganak na baka at yung bakang maliit. Yun na lang yun. Kasi binenta ko na. Next, industrial fruits. Produced by lands of any kind through cultivation or labor. Example is sugarcane, vegetable, rice, and all products of lands brought about by reason of human labor. Dito, so, industrial is may ginawa with the intervention of human. May ginawa ka. Example of that is, nagtanim ka ng palay sa inyong property. Nagtanim ka. And then, dumating yung time, yung araw na mag-aanihin na. So, yung obligation mo lang, yung right mo lang is, yung ibebenta mo na lang yun. Ibebenta mo na lang yung inani mo. Kasi nga may with human intervention. Ikaw yung nagtanim, ikaw yung aani, ikaw yun yung magbebenta, i-deliver, bebenta mo kay buyer. Next is civil fruits derived by virtue of a juridical relation. So, ang example dito is rents of buildings, prices of leases of lands, and other property. So, ang example natin dito is, binenta ko kay buyer yung isang building ko, buong units ng building ko, ng paupahan. Then, nabenta na. Si buyer na has the right to collect the remaining rental payments doon. Siya na ang may rights para mag-collect ng mga renta ng paupahan ng building na binenta ko. Kasi wala na. Ang obligation ko lang is binenta ko na, then wala na. Siya na. She has the right to collect na. Siya na yung may rights sa fruits. Ganun yun. Siya na yung may rights sa fruits na sinasabi doon. Siya na yung right to collect yung yung binenta kong building. When does obligation to deliver arises? Paano to yung deliver arises? Paano to nagkakaroon? May ano dito na perfection of the contract upon fulfillment of the condition if subject to suspensive condition. Number 3 is time specified by law. So dito sa perfection of the contract, merong ang sinasabi dito sa perfection of the contract is may kasunduan na. May kasunduan na i-deliver pero wala pang kondisyon. Walang kondisyon na nakalagay pero may kasunduan na. May napag-usapan na, may meeting na kung may kasunduan meeting na pero wala pang kondisyon. Yon. Number 2 is upon fulfillment of the condition. So dito may condition na yon. Dito naman, may condition bago i-deliver yon. May condition bago i-deliver kay creditor. Number 3 is time specified by law. Dito, may batas kang sinusunod kung kailan mo i-deliver kay creditor yon. Dito, ay may batas. Batas meaning, batas yung sinusunod mo, may batas kang sinusunod kung kailan mo i-deliver kay creditor yon. So, from that time, si creditor is may karapatan na sa mga fruits. Dun sa mga example, ganun yun. Next, to deliver its accession and accessories under Article 1166. Okay, ano yung nandito? Ano yung accession at accessories? Accessions. They include everything that is produced by a thing or is incorporated or attached. Example of this is whatever is built, planted, or sown on a parcel of land. Number 2 is accessories. This joined to or included with the principal thing for the latter's better use, perfection, or enjoyment. Example is key to a car or a house, bracelet of a wristwatch. So, an example of this is if Ben binds himself to deliver the laptop, ako na lang. Nakabind ako na i-deliver yung laptop kay Y. Then, I shall deliver it, the laptop. Tapos, dapat may kasama yung laptop. Ano yun? Yun yung charger. Kasi hindi naman gagana yung laptop kung walang charger. So, paano nagkakaroon ng accession at accessories doon sa binanggit kong example? Note that the principal is accessory follows the principal. Ano yung sinasabing principal dito? Yun yung accession. Yun yung accession. Yung accessory, yun yung accessory. So, paano nagkakaroon dito ng paano sila nagkakadugtong? Yung accessory is yun yung charger. Tapos, yung principal or accession, yun yung laptop. Paano gagana yung laptop kung walang charger? Doon yun papasok yung accession to accessories. Doon sa example ko, doon mo malalaman kung paano nagkakaroon ng the principal is accessory follows the principal. Dapat i-take note nyo yun na dapat yung accessory follows the principal. Under Article 1170 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines state that in the performance of the obligation, those who are guilty of fraud, negligence, delay, and contravention of the tenor of the obligation are liable to pay damages. Liable to pay damages meaning magbabayad sila ng mga damages. So, unahin natin dito yung fraud. Ano nga ba yung sinasabi nating fraud? Fraud is the deliberate or intentional evasion by the debtor of the normal compliance of his obligation. In other terms, ano yung fraud? Panloloko, pandaraya, panlilinlang. Intentional act. From the word intentional evasion. Intentional act meaning sinadya mong gawin yon. May panloloko yon, yung intentional act, may sinadya mong gawin yon. Yung fraud na tinutukoy dito na fraud ay yung ginawa ng debtor during the performance of his obligation. So, dito, may example is, binenta ko yung fake na diamond ko sa kaibigan ko, kay Y. Binenta ko yung fake na diamond ko kay Y. Binenta ko yung fake na diamond, which is, sinabi ko pa doon na, yung diamond na yun is worth 20,000. Tapos sinabi ko na kinuha ko yun worth 20,000 sa abroad pa, which is hindi naman totoo. Yun. May mga sinabi pa ako na galing abroad, binili ko sa abroad worth 20,000 pero ibebenta ko na lang sa kanya ng 10K. Kung alam lang dapat ni Y na peke yon, sana hindi na lang niya binili. Yun yung pagkakaintindi ko dun sa fraud. Negligence. Ano nga ba yung negligence? A failure to behave with the level of care that is someone of ordinary prudence would have exercised under the same circumstance. So, negligence, pagpapabaya sa isang bagay. So, paano nagkakaroon ng pagpapabaya? Ang example dito is yung childbirth. So, nasa ospital ka. Siyempre, manganganak ka na. Pero siyempre, nandun na yung doctors and nurses. Paano nagkakaroon ng pagpapabaya? Kailangan mo ng emergency cesarean. Pero walang umiintindi, walang nag-a-approach sa'yo. Doon na yun na yung pagpapabaya, yung negligence na sinasabi. Kailangan mo ng emergency cesarean, pero walang nagkukusa, walang kusang nag-a-assist sa'yo. Doon yun yung sinasabing negligence o pagpapabaya. Delay. The failure to perform an obligation on time, which failure constitute on breach of the obligation. So, nandito na yung sinasabing delay. Obligation on time, meaning on time mo dapat dinideliver yung obligation mo sa isang tao. So, an example dito is, may kasunduan kami ni Y na ide-deliver ko yung product, yung may de-deliver ako sa kanya on time, which is May 5 dapat. So, yun yung napagkasunduan namin na ide-deliver ko yung product on May 5 kay Y. So, after that, hindi ko nasunod yung time na pinagkasundoan namin na ide-deliver ko yon, which is na i-deliver ko ng May 6 na. So, dito pumapasok yung may obligation, may karapatan na si Y na hindi natanggapin yung binigay ko na product, which is binigay ko dapat nung May 5. May karapatan siya na hindi natanggapin, magpa-refund ng pera, at hindi natanggapin yon, which is kahit anong pilit ko na ibigay yon, kung hindi ko sinunod yung napagkasunduan na May 5 na i-deliver, hindi na yun mangyayari. Hindi ko na ma-i-deliver kasi May 6 ko na naibigay. Yun yung pagkakaintindi ko sa delay. Contravention of tenor of obligation. This means violation of contract or breach of contract. Paano nagkakaroon ng breach of contract? Example is yung contract of carriage, meaning yung mga bus or jeep, ang purpose nila, ang kanilang obligation ay ihatid yung mga passenger sa kanilang designated destination, yung kanilang dapat napupuntahan. Pero nagkakaroon ng breach of contract doon kasi yung bus or jeep, na failed niyang ihatid yung mga passenger sa kanilang destination, yung mga designated destination na kanilang pupuntahan. Doon, yun yung nagkakaroon ng breach of contract.
The expenses of having someone else comply with the obligations, Article 1165. If the thing is indeterminate or generic, he may ask that the obligation be complied with at expenses of debtor. If the obligor delays or has promised to deliver the same thing to or more persons who do not have the same interest, he shall be responsible for any fortuitous events until he has affected by the delivery. To pay damages if guilty, fraud, negligence, delay, or contraventions of the terms of the obligations, Article 1170. Contravention is a breach or violations of the provisions of a contract, states, or treaty. It states that those guilty of fraud, delay, or negligence in the performance of their obligations, or those who in any way contravene the tenor of their obligations, can be held liable for damages.
Duties of debtor or obligor in obligation to do. Number 1. This statement means do the things that is not against the laws because it the responsibility of the people to follow the laws and not to violate it. In number 2, 3, and 4, it is the Article 1167 all about. If a person obliged to do something fails to do it, the same shall be executed at his cost. To bear the expenses of having else comply with the obligation. This means you have to bear all the expenses you have to be able to comply to the obligation you have. To pay damages if guilty of fraud, negligence, delay, or contravention of the terms of the obligation. This means if you are guilty of fraud, negligence, delay, or contravention, you have to pay for the damages that you have done in the terms of obligation.
Duties of debtor or obligor in obligation not to do. This is negative personal obligation, which is consisting of an obligation of not doing something. First is not to do what has been forbidden. So you are not allowed to do it or have it. Example is you are not allowed to claim the property of others. Second is to undo what has been done that is forbidden. Means a duty or legal requirement to correct, put right, or reverse the effect of what you did that you should not have done. So example, if you move your neighbor's boundary fencing so as to gain access to a path at the back of your property, you must return it to the previous position. If you break a law by building an extension to your house without permission, it probably means that you must pay for the cost of having it demolished and the property returned to its previous state. Third is to bear the expenses of having some else undo what has been done that is forbidden. If there was a fault on the part of any of them all, shall be responsible to the creditor for the price and the payment of the damages and interest. Fourth is to pay damages of guilty of fraud, negligence, delay, or contravention of the term of the obligation. So this is Article 1170. So example is to fulfill the specification of the contract without any legal reason. It can also be defined as the failure to perform any promise forming part or whole of the contract without legal excuse. So those who are guilty of a breach of contract may not be imprisoned as it is a civil case and not a crime. They can, however, be held liable of damages as previously mentioned. We have the sources of liability of damages. First is the fraud or dolo. It is the intentional deception made by one person resulting in the injury of another. Second is the negligence or culpa. It consists in the omission by the obligor of that diligence which is required by the nature of the obligation and corresponds with the circumstances of the person of the time and of the place. Third is the delay or mora. Like when there was judicial or extrajudicial demand and the debtor does not comply, his obligation delay will occur. And lastly, is in contravention of the tenor of obligation. It refers the violation of the terms and condition or defects in the performance of the obligation, like when a landlord fails to maintain a legal and peaceful possession of a tenant leased by the latter because the landlord was not the owner, and the re-owner wants to occupy the land, there is contravention of the tenor of the obligation.